Good morning. Welcome back. You're watching Daybreak on Citizen Television. Thank you for staying with us. The hashtag on Twitter is Daybreak. The SMS code is 22422 at Citizen TV Kenya, and at Ayub Abdikadir. Will be sampling your feedback towards the tail end of this broadcast. The UN last year in November reported that the world population grew to 8 billion people across the world. This is the combination of all persons across the different parts of different continents in the world. Kenya model, the United Nations, is having an event that is set to end today, and by 2030, young Africans are set to make up 42% of the global youth. You can imagine the growing number of young Africans and what's needed to meet their needs in terms of infrastructure, education, skills and development, entrepreneurship, and their participation in policy-making processes. Also of importance to note is that 60% of Africa's population is under 25 years at the moment. Whilst the continent has half of the global arable land in terms of agriculture, the distinct aspect is that half of the continent's population, that's about 500 million people, 500 million Africans, go to bed hungry. What needs to be done to address the need or the needs of the 60% of young Africans who make up more than 60% of the population in the African continent? Now, the African Union is also having targeted measures that are meant to address the needs of the young Africans in the continent and, of course, the continent at large. Pillar number 1 is on employment and entrepreneurship. This is part of the involvement in having them economically empowered and having money in their pockets, the value of the shilling across the continent in the pockets of young Africans to spur development that will largely affect communities across the continent. The AU has also pillar number 2 in the aspect of education and skills development. This cutting across many countries in the continent, and that ratified by countries that make up the African continent in terms of getting them educated and quality education for that matter, and skills development for them to fit into the job markets to spur economic growth across the continent. The third pillar by the African Union, which targets young Africans, is on the health and well-being of young Africans and staving them off the disadvantages that they normally encounter with in terms of drug abuse and others. Therefore, the medication part, the well-being in terms of their psychological state, and having them properly well-sculptured to be members of the society and help in the growth of the continent's economic progress. Pillar number 4 is on the AU's pillar on rights and governance and empowerment. This cuts across the aspect of governance, democracy, and their participation in the policy-making process as part of getting young Africans involved. A good example has been the recently concluded elections in Nigeria, where young Nigerians have stayed out, or rather opted to back Peter Obi, though he never won the presidential election in Nigeria. But many Africans who are young are yearning for participation in the political processes across the continent, opening up the continent in terms of the democratic space and holding those in government or in power or in authority to account, therefore, the empowerment that comes with it. According to the AU Commission, which is part of the very key stakeholder that is targeting the continent, the Status of Africa Youth Report is an important tool that speaks to Africa and the countries in the continent. I'd like to encourage everyone to use the data from the report to inform program development and policies that come about, to use evidence to inform what is done on the ground. That's according to Prudence Nonkuleko Ngwenya, who is the head of the Youth Division, the Africa Union Commission. And in terms of course, the numbers of the Kenya model, the United Nations in the continent, 31 of the 55 African countries have a national youth policy that is meant to target young Africans in terms of their involvement in the different aspects and pillars that the AU has outlined. Let me now get the account of the Secretary General of the Kenya UN model, who is with us in studio. Good morning, Sam. And what's the intent of this event that you are organizing, and to what extent do you think it fits into some of the agendas that have been outlined by the AU?
All right, thank you so much for having me here this morning. So basically at Kenya Model United Nations, what we do is that we simulate the United Nations. So we normally engage about up to 1,000 students in universities across Kenya. We engage in debates, stimulating conversations. So how we as Kenya fit into the global picture in terms of, building the capacity of African youth is through providing an avenue for them to be able to share their ideas, to be able to actually understand what is happening. We have a phrase that we say, think global but act local, right? How do you build a global perspective that allows one to open their mind and therefore they can know this is a global perspective, but this is how I can actually apply it to my context, to my community at home. So what we do, we try to expose them, we try to build the capacity to be critical, to be critical thinkers, not to accept the status quo, but to always say, what, how can I impact my community and how can I change the narrative and own it, as a young African, as a young student in university. And that's what we do at Kenya MUN.
Okay. I'll be seeking some answers as to how you are also working with the United Nations, because it's a key stakeholder. But Lavender, some talks about the status quo. Is that likely to change with the taking part of young people in business, in the economy, in political participation, in health and their well-being? Are we likely to see a change in terms of the status quo?
I think that is now the most important thing that we should be looking into, because we have all these policies that are looking so good on paper, but what is the implementation? How are we going to implement them? Are we having that political goodwill locally, like in Kenya? Are youths having that space to do what they want, do what they can? So I think changing of status quo is with the youth to come out strongly and say, it's enough. We want to do things as young people. We are no longer going to be used by the old to at least manipulate us to get their way, because that has been the case. Young people are being used by politicians. They pretend that, we care about the youth. Each and every election, they come with these good policies that they want to implement, the things that they want to do to the young people. By the end of it, when governments are formed, are we seeing youth having space in government? Like right now, we have a new administration. Though it is still very young, it's just 6 months into office. But we really want to take the president into action. We want to see him acting, ensuring that the youth are having space. Because we have a president that has a beautiful history. When he's talking about his past, he will tell you he got into power when he was only 31 years old. And at that time, there were big names who were also looking for the same seats. Actually, he said how the then President Moi, went to his constituency and told people that, even if you are electing an MP, chagua yule mwenye anajulikana. So the president himself knows very well the challenges that are facing young people in this country. He's somebody who can relate what the young people are going through. Because even if you check his educational background, he will tell you, I started at Kamagut Primary School, okay. I went to Warang secondary school. So it is something that so many Kenyans can relate with. It's not an issue of, I went to St. Andrew's Turi, I went to Peponi School, which is not bad. But we're just trying to say we have a president who really understands the challenges that are facing the young people of this country. So it is upon him to ensure that his government is creating space for the young people. Otherwise, we'll continue having these good policies on paper, but they just remain at that. We come here talking about the youth and the future, but that future will never come. So it is now that we have to fight for that space to ensure that the young people are really taken care of. Okay, Biggie, I'll come to you. Joya Wich, as a human rights lawyer and advocate of young people in Kenya and also across the continent, certainly what we see are mechanisms. But do you see commitment to that cause?
I would like to say that commitment is a two-way street, all right? Even when we talk about relationships, marriages and whatnot, for anything to work, it's a two-way connection, right? And so there could be policies in place. You have mentioned that there's only one country in all the 55 African countries that have a youth policy. Why is that the problem? We are waiting as young people for the government to involve us, not knowing the things or the policies that are in place for us to actually be involved. Let me take, for example, we recently had elections just last year. Recently, Lavender has mentioned that 6 months, the government has just been in power for the new government for about 6 months, right? So when it was time to select leaders for our country, the youth did not turn up to vote. That is one of the most basic ways and one of our fundamental rights and ways in which everyone, all citizens, can get involved in government. all right? And we can even see with our government right now that we are seeing a rhetoric around those who supported us are the ones that will benefit from us, right? And so if that is how life works, if the youth did not turn out, if we did not show up, and if we continue to not show up for ourselves and show up for our government, how then shall the government implement policies for those who do not, who are not present? Mm-hmm. We're talking about youth representation. Youth representation in policy or in government can only exist if we get involved in the conversations and right from the beginning as well, through public participation, through voting, and getting involved in the different levels of government. Are we aware of the policies that are in place for us to be involved in government? Let's talk about bill making, okay, for example. When we're talking about bill making, there's a process. Do we know, as young people, that you have a right to petition Parliament on bills? Mm-hmm. Do we know that you can get involved in the budgetary process, which is one of the most important ways to get involved in the projects that the government is supposed to undertake? If I'm not part of the conversation with the government and I decide and say, these are the people, it's never going to change. We talked about changing status quo, but the status quo will not change if I don't get involved. If I sit back and say that my vote will not count anyway, they will still elect the same leaders. But what if I make the difference to get involved? Because there are statistics that in the last 15 years, the youth, the percentage of the young people or the voters have reduced significantly, and they keep reducing by about 3% every 5 years. Okay, yeah. We'll talk about a majority of young Kenyans who never voted in the elections in August. Beggy, coming to you, because I want us to coil this conversation around what's happening in Kenya, of course, to what's happening across the continent. For in 7 years' time, young Africans will make up 42% of the global youth. That's a big number. But Beggy, coming to you, when you look at this growing number, is there commensurate and proper policies in place to address the needs of this growing number of young Africans and young Kenyans, to be specific?
Good morning again, Ayub. I would say, first I'll ask myself one question. Why are the youth not voting? Yeah? It's because of the system that has been there before. I've said this before, I think, in this same station, that leaders come in, promise this, and it never happens. And I would really understand and reason with them why they tend to fear or not have an interest in voting, is because they realize after that they are alone. Be with that and be it that way. It's not a reason why we should not be actively involved in setting up policies like you're asking. Is there enough policies around that the youth can depend on and have a plan? I mean, give them a plan and a future? Yes, policies are there. Do we have easier modules of implementing these policies? That is where the challenge comes in. And that is why every time young people keep requesting that young matters should be handled by them, they do not mind having any seniors around to maybe for, what can I say, institutional memory, but they should be given a chance to be able to participate fully. Again, when it comes to giving a chance, is another story on its own. How do you even access that opportunity? How do you get a chance to be a team player? Is equally dependent on the aggressiveness of the young people that has to come from them. I don't think there's any leader who will go out of the streets and look for people who are not interested in doing something. But again, I want to believe that there are so many other young people who have the interest. Okay. The only thing government needs to do is open more room for young people to participate and allow them to make their mistakes, because that's how the life is. Unless you are able to be given a chance to make a mistake, you'll never learn and you'll never be a better person. So why not? You see, even every parent, let's talk as parents. Okay. No parent disowns the other child because he's not performing in school or is not as good as the other kid, but they always think about their welfare and they always try to find a way of involving them actively so that they can see where they're weak and improve generally. So that is, I think, the angle government should pick and see, you know what, these young people who are being suppressed, and they're not being suppressed by, I'm sorry to say this, but I feel the immediate leaders who take over. The MPs, the senators, the women reps are the people who suppress the young people because they know how skillful and how aggressive they can be.
Okay, we'll talk about how to, I mean, crop them up. But when you talk about welfare, Beggy,
yes.
I mean, is there a framework within which the welfare of young Africans or young Kenyans, for example, in employment and entrepreneurship, education and skills development, health and well-being, and talking about rights, governance and empowerment, which is a topic on its own, is properly modeled to have them engaged? Is that a process that you can hand on heart say is practical?
When it comes to employment, I will say no. When it comes to maybe entrepreneurship, I'll say yes, because in one way or another, the government has given even a chance for women and youth to actively, directly involve themselves in entrepreneurship. But when you come to employment, in Ibidiako, and I wouldn't say there's a proper structure or welfare that caters about the young people. I will not agree to it. I don't think there is. And if there is, I would want to be exposed to it.
Okay. Yeah. Sam, coming to you, the Kenya UN model, I'm sure this is an intertwinement of the goals by Kenya, of course, the SDGs and the others, and what the UN has in terms of its goals that it plans to attain. But you have this growing number of population across the world. In your engagements with the United Nations, how are you, at what level are you talking about the needs of these young Africans? For we are talking about a continent that has half of the world's arable land, but half a billion people, that's about 500 million Africans, go to bed hungry.
Well, I think it's quite I would say a difficult thing, but it's something we really work hard to push for. So as much as we get to engage with the United Nations, and of course, we be able to provide our solutions to them, it's very difficult to be able to be heard properly. So I think what we see to do as Kenya MUN is kind of say, you know what, we are here, we want to do this and want to change, help us get there, right? Because as I said, we have to be very aggressive about our space. And what I always tell my members is that you have to be very bold and audacious about what you want and what you want to see happening, right? So if we find this problem and we see that, hey, people are actually not getting enough food and whatnot, how can we get that space where we can actually be innovative and creative? How do we empower the youth to actually own their space and own their narrative, right? So as we engage in the United Nations, what we do is, number one, after we have our conference this week, we present our solutions to them. And be like, hey, we have met over 1,000 youths this entire week. Here are our solutions. And we're actually going to work with them to see how can they be implemented. Because guys have actually proposed wonderful solutions, right? But we're wondering, okay, fine, we won't just debate in a room, but how do you translate our ideas into action and tangible, right? And of course, that requires a lot of lobbying, a lot of reframing what you're saying. You have to also, fit into the global context, especially of the United Nations, right? You have to understand what is happening globally, therefore you can see how your policy and your ideas can fit into the global scheme. Therefore, it actually gains momentum, it gains more power, you also get goodwill, and of course we also partner up with a lot of embassies around Nairobi as well, who also have goodwill, to actually work with the youth, empower them, and really help them grow. I think one of them is the Moroccan embassy. This year it's big on climate change, and Morocco is the presidency of the UNEA happening next year. So we already begin to engage them. How can we empower the youth to understand climate change, to be innovative, right, to be able to come up with solutions? Other embassy, there's the Israeli embassy. We know Israel, they're a small country, but they produce a lot of food because of the technology, right? So how do we engage our stakeholders who are doing a lot of wonderful things out there to come and empower our youth here in Kenya to be like, hey, here are the solutions that you can actually implement and actually make them work to the Kenyan context.
Mm-hmm. Joy, then coming to you, because you are a human rights lawyer, and there is a growing significance in terms of the scale of shrinking democratic space across the continent. And we'll be talking about elections, whatnot, and the need for constitutionalism and the rule of law across the continent. However, then how will young people take up these spaces in terms of engaging in civic education, awareness, with regards to understanding how the law works, the framework of constitutionalism, and have a governance model that not only addresses the yearnings of the young people, but Africa as a whole?
Okay. Thank you for your question. I like what Samuel said at the beginning when he said, think global and act local. Mm-hmm. And that's the kind of response that I'm going to give to you. In terms, when we think about the local structures that are present for the young people to be involved in government for civic engagement in the sense, first of all, everything begins with self. And then from there, I begin to mobilize and create a sphere of influence with those that are around me. I start with my group of 10 friends, and I begin to inform them that these are the ways in which you can be involved in government. These are the policies that are in place. This is the way I earlier spoke about how you can petition the parliament on any bill and on any conversations. Do we also know that are we aware? Do we read newspapers? Do we keep abreast with when the government calls for public participation, when they say we have a forum? Do you know your MCA? Do you know the MCA? That's because MCAs are those that we have direct contact with in our counties. So do I know who my MCA is? Do I know do I stay informed to know when we have a meeting or a forum where he's inviting the voices of the young people? Because we recognize that it is no secret that when you're in government, you're very busy. There's a lot to be done. There are a lot of problems, many things to be solved. Our government right now is dealing with inflation, and that is a crisis. So they are looking and seeking for young people who can come up with solutions. If I come to my MCA and present a bill and say, I drafted even just 3 paragraphs of this bill and I suggest this to you, it will be taken into consideration because it saves the government time. So those are one of the ways that we can be involved. Also, do we know the opportunities that we have in every county? In every county, there's a youth department. In the youth department, there are different positions. You can be a CEC, you can be chief officer. Do I look forward to these positions and want to be involved in these instead of sitting back and saying that I possibly studied only, let's say, I studied biochemistry, and so this is what I'll stay in, and there's no job for me. There are no industries here that are currently doing this. What are the ways I can be part of the solution and actually apply for these government positions at the local and county level?
Okay.
Yes.
Lavender, then to change the picture at the moment, I mean, and moving away from this discussion that more or less is becoming a cliche, then at what point are young people going to take up these spaces? I mean, when you talk about them not voting, that is clearly the no blame on the part of those who are in power because you never exercise your democratic right. Then expecting policies from the same people who you have accused of side-dialing you is another extra layer of complexity of the problems facing you. At what point will they understand the power that lies with the numbers and take part?
I think, Ayub, that's a good question. And that is why in my first submission, I tried to bring out the example of the person that is the head of state right now, because I wanted us to understand where the problem is. It will boil down to political goodwill at the end of the day and how our youth are feeling towards a government. I think even in the last election, majority of those who did not turn out to vote were the young people. Why? Because they're feeling dejected. They don't feel part of that government. And I wouldn't say that youth have not tried to take up spaces. Personally, I vied for a county seat and I campaigned for 2 good years. There were big names, people were everything, but I said I have to do it. I campaigned without tagging along big names. And I'm so sure that it went well, save for the few things that did not really end up well at the end of the day. But I'm proud of what I did. Because I said, if we keep on complaining that these people are not giving us spaces, then we will not do anything. So I urge young people to always come out and do what we feel is right. Let us claim these spaces. Let us stop complaining, because no one will come for you where you are hiding. It come, we give you this. No, you have to come out and do it. Let us keep trying. There'll come a time they'll say, oh, this one has been trying. Let us just give her the space. Let us give him the space. But I urge the young people, if we continue being dominant, there's going to be a serious generational gap. So I will still stress on this. The leadership of this country should ensure that the young people are given fair chances. Because we are really trying, you are applying for this. But again, if you don't know the person that is giving out that job, you are not going to get it. There's tribalism, there's classism, if I can say so, nepotism. You go to a government office, people are speaking mother tongue from up to the top. And you wonder now, what is this, you know? So we can be speaking these good policies here. We have the framework, we want to do this, we want to do this, we want to think globally, as my friend here is saying.
Okay.
But if we lack that goodwill, I'm speaking from experience because I've been there. And then these established politicians, they like manipulating young people. They want you to go and lay down and beg them now, please, please, please. So we have a population of young people who are capable, but what is lacking is the political goodwill.
Okay, but when you talk, I'll come to you, Becky.
Yes.
When you talk about the numbers,
yes,
and you also gave a scope of the head of state, President William Ruto's journey.
Journey, yes.
Yeah, a synopsis of what started in Wasingishu County to the top office in the land.
Yes.
Do you then foresee, do you see the goodwill in his administration to address some of the problems that you have highlighted?
I can't say there's no goodwill because we are just 6 months old in this new administration. So I don't want to be pessimistic. Let us give him the benefit of doubt, hoping that in the coming months we are going to see a change. When you look at the people who are appointed PSs, some of them were relatively young, quite a good number. I think that is a good sign, and we hope is going to continue with the same spirit, so that we also feel part of this government. You know, I heard of a story where people are talking about old money. You know, these people who made money, kitambo. So to them, it's about their children, their grandchildren, their relatives, and everything. But now when you take a new person, somebody who has never been there before, you give him something, you give him an office. He'll also think about his peers. You know, you go to this office, and now they'll give you that audience to say whatever you want. So I think to some extent, he has tried. Let us not just say he's not doing anything. But we are hoping to see, even in their coming appointments, young people given opportunities to serve this nation. Because that is where everything begins.
Thank you.
We cannot be saying all these things about global African Union if in Kenya, locally here, nothing is being done.
Okay, and of course Kenya is part of the African countries.
Yeah, Kenya is part of the African countries.
Thank
but
you.
we have to start with the domestic policies that are favorable to the young people.
Okay, thank you. We'll talk more about the pillars by the African Union, for Kenya is a key member of the continent under the AU Commission. Begi, I'll come to you after the break, and when we get back from the break, we continue with the discussion here on the broadcast. The hashtag on Twitter is Daybreak. The SMS code is 22422 at Citizen TV Kenya and at Ayub Abdikadir. We welcome your contributions as well here on the broadcast. We'll be sampling them as we proceed with the broadcast here on Citizen TV, and later towards the tail end of this broadcast, we'll be getting some up as we also put the same to our panelists here in studio. More after the break. Stay tuned.